it's time we talk about our leadership.
Yeah, I think there's an important point here about leadership.
New Chumash, Chumash Vayikra, the third Chumash in the 5 Chumashim we have. And in Sefer Vayikra, in general, we talk about the different mitzvot Am Yisrael has, different mitzvot Am Yisrael is commanded. And Sefer Vayikra begins with the korbanot, the sacrifices that Am Yisrael had to bring, because at the end of Sefer Shemot, we were just finishing to build the Mishkan. So now HaKadosh Baruch Hu is commanding Moshe what korbanot, what sacrifice have to be brought in this Mishkan and later on in the Mikdash. When you look at this week's Parasha, we find a lot of different korbanot, and in the middle, towards the end of the Parasha, we find the korbanot chatat. And korbanot chatat split into 2 different korbanot. You have chatat, actual korban, which you have to bring when you sin unpurposely, when you sin bishgaga, when you didn't mean to do that. And then you have korban hasham for different cases, situations in which you did bad things, which are different than a korban chatat. When you look at the korban chatat, though, there are different types of korbanot chatat that have to be brought. And it's interesting because the Torah uses a different language to describe what prompts that korban. Because when we look in the psukim, we see that if an individual person, or a kohen mashuach milchama, or if all of Am Yisrael together sin a sin unpurposely, they do it by mistake, the Torah says if they do that, and then they have to bring a korban. However, when we get to the king, to the nasi that sins, the Torah begins with the word asher nasi echeta, that when the president, when the nasi, when the king will sin. And obviously this is a very interesting change of language, and there are many perushim, many midrashim on this pasuk, on this language, on the change of language. Even Rashi brings the midrash that says asher yado, lucky the generation that the king, that the leader of that generation is able to admit their sin. But again, this is Rashi bringing a midrash. But on the pshat level, why is there a difference between the languages? Why does the Torah emphasize that the leader, that the king will sin and will bring a korban?
Well, I think that all the cynical people are going to obviously say, well, he's a politician. All the politicians are corrupt. But I don't think that that's what the Torah is trying to teach us. But I think the Torah is actually teaching something very, very important about the concept of sin, about the essence of sin and how the Torah sees sin. Because sin is not seen as something which God is shocked that happened. It's unexpected. You know, God told us to do what we're supposed to do. How could it possibly be that we did something else? The opposite. We start this Parsha with the korbanot, and some of them are discussing the concept of sin and how to deal with sin and how to fix sin. And we know that even from creation already, Chazal teach us that even during creation, God told the trees to be etz pri, oseh pri, meaning that the tree would have the taste of the fruit already within it, and that the tree ended up doing etz oseh pri and messed up already at the beginning, meaning that part of creation is that things aren't perfect. That's why we're here. We're here to try to make things better, to take things the next level, to mess up on the way, to step forward, to fall again, and to get up. That's what life is about. That's what struggle is about. That's what growing is about. You step up, you fall, you step up again. And you know, there's a famous pasuk in Kohelet that says, "Ein tzadik ba'aretz asher ya'aseh tov v'lo yachta." There's no such thing as a righteous person in the world who won't sin. But actually, that's not exactly what it says. It doesn't say that there is no righteous person who won't sin. It says there's no righteous person who will do good and not sin. You could do nothing. If you do nothing, you won't sin. You sit back, you don't do anything, no good, no bad. And some people, from fear of messing up, go into that mode. I just won't do anything, so I don't mess up. But the Torah says otherwise. No, if you want to do good in this world, it comes sometimes with chet. It comes sometimes with missing out. As we discussed last year, that the concept of chet in Hebrew means to miss. You know, if you don't try to throw to the basket, you're never going to miss a shot. But if you do, you're going to miss also on the way. And maybe that's what the Torah is saying. Yes, being a leader, being the nasi, that comes with messing up. You know, if you're an individual, you may not mess up as much as a leader would. But yes, if you're gonna lead, if you're gonna do in this world, it's gonna come with struggles. And therefore, when it talks about the nasi, it says, Asher nasi echta. Yes, doing, leading, creating things in the world is gonna come with mistakes. But that's why the korbanot are here, because the korbanot are teaching us something very important. We all know that we need to fix mistakes. Everyone accepts that concept of, you know, I made a mistake, I need to learn from the past and do better in the future. Fixing mistakes is all about the future, but the korban is not. The korban is focused on the past. The korban is saying, don't only fix your future. It's possible to fix your past. It's possible to do an action that will help you clean up, change, lechaper al nafshotechem, to clean up your souls, to fix your souls, to fix the past. That's what the korban brings us. It brings us that ability. accountability. But I think this connects to another point, which takes this even deeper. When we speak about the individual, the language that's used is if, but there's another interesting word, nefesh. Nefesh is not even Adam, like we saw earlier in the Parsha, not a person. Nefesh is your soul. Nefesh ki techta. Whereas when we speak about the Nasi, we're not talking about his soul, or maybe not even talking about the person. We're talking about the role, right? That's why there's a special korban, because it's not about him as an individual, it's about him as a leader. And that's another difference. Leaders, roles, there's mistakes, there's things that are messed up and flawed within that process. But the nefesh im techta, meaning even though we say people will sin and do sin, when we talk about the nefesh, we don't say nefesh asher techta, even though we just said that people are going to mess up. But the words im and ki give over a totally different message, because what they're actually saying is that messing up, that sin, that bad is like a coincidence towards your soul. Your soul in essence is good. If it did mess up, it's ki techta, im techta, if it's not built into who you are. Who you are is good in the inside. That's what's real. That's what's true. Your soul is good. Your soul wants good. This is true about you, and this is true about all the people around you as well. If people mess up, if people do wrong, it's not who they are. It's what they did. It's the mess ups. It's a coincidence. And maybe that's the basis of the concept of the korban and fixing the past. Because if it was who you are, maybe you couldn't change that. But because we understand that it's not who you are in essence, then when you sacrifice, when you try and bring yourself back to your real self, that real self was there all the time, even at the time of sin. And therefore, when you do that process, when you do that tshuva, you're able not only to fix the future, but you're able to fix the past and clean up those mistakes which are external to your true essence and connect back to the true you and connect back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
Very good. And what you were just saying, how going back to who you really are, it's a very big discussion and argument among the philosophers of all the generations, whether a human is born to do good or a human is born to do bad. However, we in Yiddishkeit and Judaism believe that, of course, a human is born to do good. A human is born as a good individual, as a good person. And sometimes during life, bad things happen and bad things occur. But the idea is that when you sin, you have to go back, like you were saying, to what you originally are, to your original good. And really, we mentioned this in the past, where the word korban means lehitkarev, to get closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But like you were just saying, the word korban also doesn't mean just getting closer back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but also getting closer back to who you were. As words as Rab Nachman uses in Likutei Moharan, ki ha'yitrachkut tchilat ha'yitkarvut, that when a person actually sins and feels the sin, the fact that you feel the sin means you're already getting closer, meaning you already have your path set back towards where you want to go back to, towards where you originally want to go. Because obviously, when you don't feel the sin, when you don't feel like you did something bad, when you don't recognize that you actually did something bad, you are in a worse place to begin with, because you don't even know that you are in a bad place now. But once you understand that you sinned, that already begins the process of heading back, of the hitkarvut, of bringing that korban. And that's why really, when you look at the psukim, it's interesting, because the beginning of the process, according to the psukim, is to bring that korban. That once you have to veikrivu korban or veiviu, first you have to bring that korban. After that, vesamach yado veitvada smicha and the vidui and everything else, and only then comes the kapara. But really, the first step is to bring that korban, to get back closer. Just like Rab Nachman is really saying, ki ha'yitrachkut tchilat ha'yitkarvut, that the first step, actually by going further away and understanding you went further away, is already getting back closer. Same thing we see in the psukim, that the first step is to bring the korban, to do that hitkarvut, and only after that comes the actual tshuva of the smicha and the vidui and everything else that tshuva involves with it, and then the kapara, and then the forgiveness. But really, the first step to take is the recognition, is understanding that you have to get closer, that you have to bring that korban, that you need to hitkarev, that you went too far away, and you have to go back to your original good, like you were saying. And maybe that's what korban means. The idea of getting closer is understanding that you went further away, because you can't get closer, you can't get back, unless you understand that you are now further away from where you're supposed to be. Once you have that realization that you went far, once you understood that you went far, hitrachakta, you had the hitrachkut, that's already the beginning of the hitkavut. That's already the beginning of getting back to where you're supposed to be. And just like you were saying also, we mentioned last year, it's so important to understand that the concept of sin for itself is not a terrible thing. It's a bad thing you did, but a sin comes from a good power you have. You just have to learn how to use it in the right direction. You just have to understand how to use it in the good way in order to create good in the world, and chas v'chalila, not to create bad in the world. And going back to what we were saying about the Nasi, about how is it that the Torah says that when the Nasi sins, because there's no if, it's only a when. But really, like you were saying, when you look at today at leadership, at our leadership in today's world, it's kind of obvious that they are corrupt and that they sin and things things like that. But going back to what the Torah taught us and going back to the time of Chazal, the great leaders of Am Yisrael obviously were the special individuals that had these special traits in them. Just like the Midrash says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tested Moshe Rabbeinu and David HaMelech before they were chosen to be the leaders of Am Yisrael. And we know famously that Moshe Rabbeinu, even though he was the biggest leader we ever had, he was also the most humble person in the world ever to live. Anav Mikol Adam, and he did not let that leadership get to him. And also by David HaMelech, when you read the Psukim, that when he was chosen by Shmuel to be the king, he was almost not chosen. David wasn't even there when Shmuel was looking for him. And you can see the humbleness of David HaMelech coming out of the Psukim, out of the stories, especially when he is dealing with Shaul and trying not to overstep his kingdomship. But maybe this idea of where on the one hand being the most powerful leader that we have, but on the other hand having this greatest humility is something that is needed to go together. And once you have that, you also don't have a problem admitting that you were wrong and admitting that you sinned. And maybe this is what the Torah is also trying to tell us here. Asher nasiach eta ashrei ador, meaning that the generation that has a leader like that on the one hand understands their leadership, understands the power they have, and leads the nation to the right direction. However, on the other hand, has that humility, has that anava within them, and therefore recognizes the sin that they did. This reflects back on the generation that deserves such a great leader. That generation is a generation that should be proud of who they are, of their generation, because they are worthy of such a leadership. And lo aleinu, a generation that does not have a leadership like that obviously reflects the generation. And again, looking at David HaMelech, he teaches us in Tehillim, Anochi tolad velo ish, I am a worm, I'm not even a person, even though he was this great king. He also teaches us the ability to do tshuva when you are that powerful king, when you have everybody looking up to you and looking to what you're doing and listening to you and expecting you to be this righteous person and this great person. He had the ability to stop and admit that he sinned and admit that he had to bring a korban chatat. And looking at this week's parasha and at these psukim, at the stories of the different leaders we had from Moshe Rabbeinu through David HaMelech, and even until Rebbe that signed the Mishnah and was the great leader back at those days, that he was also the most wealthiest person, the leader, the actual materialistic leader, but also the spiritual leader, one of the greatest rabbis we had. And yet Mishemet Rebbe Betela Anava, that he was also the most humble person in that generation. We can only long to those days when our leaders were like that, and only hope that in Mirz Hashem the days will come that our leaders will be like that again today.
Well, we're also reading Parshat Zachor this week about Amalek, and I think that very much connects to a contrast of what we were saying before about sin. Because as the Psukim say, Asher karcha baderech, Amalek is about coincidence. It's about looking at everything that happens in the world and saying it's a coincidence. They're the ones who saw Am Yisrael go out of Egypt, split the seas, and everyone stood around and didn't dare touch Am Yisrael. And they said, whatever, it's just a coincidence. Everything's just a coincidence. How many times in life people can ruin some great moments? Someone achieved something great, it was luck. It was just a coincidence. When you say that, you rip apart the good and the essence in the good that someone achieved or the good that happened in this world. God does good to you, and no, it was just a coincidence. Or you achieved good, and no, it was just a coincidence. And I think this is the exact contrast to the concept of im nefesh techta, nefesh ki techta. Because what we're saying is evil, bad, mistakes, that's the coincidence. The essence is good. Good of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, good of human beings, that's the true essence. The evil, the bad, that's the coincidence. That's the mistake. That's the thing that's here today and is gone tomorrow. And this is the exact contrast to that approach to life, to that approach to the world that sees all the good as just being lucky, all the good is just a coincidence, and gets so focused in on the bad. No, that's the reality. Things don't go well. Things are messed up. Things are bad. And if they do work out, that's just being lucky. Judaism doesn't believe in that, and especially on Purim, and especially with Amalek, not only do we not believe in that, we go to the exact opposite of that, to the exact contrast of that, and say, no, good is reality. Good is the essence of things. People are good. The world is good. HaKadosh Baruch Hu does good. And there are mess-ups in the world, and there are challenges, but that's just on the way to achieving more good and more growth.
Yeah, of course, you mentioned Purim. As Purim is coming up, and Amalek, Haman and Russia are still around until today. Some people are trying to get to agreements with them in Europe, in the middle of Europe. But Baruch Hashem, it's Chodesh Adar, the month shenehapach lehem miyagon lesimcha. We can only continue praying that things will end up being great for Am Yisrael. And again, in Mirz Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu shall bring back strength and humility to our leadership to understand that they are only servants for Am Yisrael and not something else. But we're out of time and done with politics. So if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to subscribe and like this video, share it with your friends, and of course, again, comment below on the video in YouTube. We'll just remind again, last year, Parshat Vayikra was before Pesach, and we discussed the concept of a chit, discussed the idea, more than that, of the Brit Melech that we find in this week's Parsha. Why is salt such an important covenant? Why is salt such an important part of our meals? We'll link that video right now. And Yitzi, next week, special video for Purim. So shkoyach.
Shkoyach, Tuvia, Shabbat Shalom.
Shkoyach to you, Shabbat Shalom. And again, we'll talk next week in Mitzvah Shem for Purim. For more Talking Torah videos on different topics, check out our YouTube channel.